There's a conflict unfolding right now that almost nobody is paying attention to. And no, it's not in the Middle East. It's not about China or Iran either. Tonight, I want to talk about war. A potential war that could be much closer than most people realize. A war involving the United States and Venezuela. Because whether people want to admit it or not, the pieces are already moving. Just look at what's happening. Massive U.S. naval deployments, fighter jets sent into the Caribbean, the largest warships ever built positioning themselves near Latin America. And suddenly, the headlines start to change. For months now, the U.S. has been laying the groundwork for something that looks very familiar if you've been paying attention to history. It looks a lot like regime change. And what caught my attention isn't just Venezuela itself, but how the story is being sold. As you get older, patterns become easier to spot. You start recognizing the same narrative structures being recycled over and over again. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The psychology behind how governments sell war to their people is almost formulaic. So why Venezuela? Why now? We're told it's about democracy, human rights, drugs, security. We're told the Maduro government is illegitimate, that it's a criminal organization, that the president himself is a drug trafficker with a bounty on his head. And all of that sounds alarming enough to justify action. But there's another story beneath the surface. A story about oil, power, money, and control. A story about China, Russia, and the future of global influence. And Venezuela happens to sit right in the middle of it. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia, more than anyone, and that fact alone explains more than most headlines ever will. But here's the problem. War is deeply unpopular. People don't like the idea of sending money, weapons, or lives into another foreign conflict. So how do you sell it? You sell it by choosing the right narrative. If the drug story doesn't resonate with you, then maybe the economic angle will. Socialism failed, capitalism wins. Venezuela is a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when governments control markets. And if that still doesn't work, there's always the most powerful narrative of all: morality, freedom, democracy, human rights. It's the same playbook every time. There's always a moral frame to make intervention feel necessary. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, different countries, same story. This time, it's Venezuela, and yes, Venezuela is in terrible shape. The economy collapsed. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Millions fled the country. Corruption is everywhere. People are hungry. That's all real, but here's the uncomfortable part. That's not why the U.S. cares. If human rights were the real reason, we'd see the same outrage directed at Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or other authoritarian allies. But we don't. Those countries get a pass because they align with U.S. interests. So what makes Venezuela different? Alignment. Venezuela works with China, Russia, Iran, and that changes everything. Every barrel of oil Venezuela sells outside the U.S. system weakens American leverage. Every shipment priced outside the dollar chips away at U.S. influence. That's the real issue. Now let's talk about the official story, because it matters. The first narrative being pushed is the war on drugs. Venezuela is described as a narco state, a hub for trafficking fentanyl and cocaine into the U.S. On paper, that sounds like a national security threat. But according to the DEA's own data, the vast majority of fentanyl comes from Mexico, not Venezuela. Venezuela accounts for a relatively small fraction of global drug trafficking, but the language matters. Calling it a drug problem isn't enough. That's law enforcement. Calling it narco terrorism changes everything. Once something is labeled terrorism, the rules change. Congress approval becomes optional. Military action becomes justified. drone strikes become acceptable. That's why reclassification is always step one. Create a villain. Redefine them as terrorists. Sell it as moral necessity, but maybe drugs don't concern you, so there's the second narrative, socialism. Venezuela is used as proof that socialism doesn't work, and it's true that corruption and mismanagement played a massive role in its collapse. But that's not the whole picture. Over the years, the U.S. imposed more than 150 sanctions on Venezuela. Sanctions that blocked trade, restricted oil sales, froze assets, and cut the country off from global markets. By 2020, Venezuela's GDP had fallen by roughly 30%. Food shortages, medicine shortages, infrastructure collapse. The media showed empty shelves, but rarely explained why imports were blocked. So yes, Venezuela created its own crisis. But sanctions made recovery nearly impossible, and that part is always left out. Because the narrative is effective, it reinforces a belief many already hold, that capitalism equals freedom, and countries that reject it are destined to fail. Then comes the third and most powerful narrative, democracy. This one appeals directly to identity and morality. Venezuela is a dictatorship. People are oppressed. Elections are rigged. Journalists are silenced. Protesters are crushed. And again, much of that is true, but it's also selectively applied. The U.S. has no issue working with authoritarian governments when it benefits them. Democracy only becomes urgent when a country steps out of line. This pattern isn't new. It's been repeating for decades. Each conflict sold as necessary, each one framed as doing the right thing, and each one leaving behind instability, refugees, and power vacuums. So if all of this is the story we're told, what's the real reason? Oil, influence, money. Venezuela's oil reserves are massive. Roughly 300 billion barrels. Control over that energy means control over leverage. For decades, oil traded in dollars reinforced U.S. dominance. The Petrodollar system made the dollar king, but that system is cracking. China and Russia are building alternatives. BRICS is expanding. Oil is being traded in yuan. Some deals are backed by gold. Venezuela, cut off from Western markets, turned to China. China lent Venezuela over $60 billion. In return, it secured long-term access to oil. Every shipment strengthens China's energy security and weakens U.S. leverage. That's why this matters, not because Venezuela is corrupt, not because it's socialist, but because it's part of a much larger shift. The U.S. doesn't need to invade anymore. It can isolate, sanctions, banking restrictions, insurance bans. Shipping risks, and for smaller countries that's devastating, but there's irony here. The harder the U.S. squeezes, the more countries turn to each other. New alliances form, alternative systems grow. Every country pushed out of the dollar system helps build something new without the U.S. at the center. That's what we're watching right now, a slow transition, a shift in power, and conflicts like Venezuela are pressure points in that transition. If you made it this far, here's my honest take. I don't pretend to have the answers. Running a country is hard. Running a superpower is harder. These decisions are complex, and the consequences are enormous. I'm not here to tell you what's right or wrong. My goal is simply to understand what's happening, to see patterns, to think critically, and if history is any guide, we're likely to see more conflicts like this. Not always declared as wars, but fought through pressure, influence, and control. If this helped you think a little differently, then it did its job. As always, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.